So how you been?
Doing well, thriving. I guess thriving and surviving is what I like to call it. Enduring and enjoying. How are you?
Yeah, enduring is about right. I mean, 23 years, I've never had a school year like this. But tell me about your new job at Unbound Ed.
Well, been here a couple years now, and we're starting a whole new cohort. I'm the director of programs engagement with Unbound Ed, and we have a whole brand new group of people that are system leaders and also school-based leaders, and we take them through a whole year of a journey, a learning journey where they learn more anti-racist practice, both at the system level and also at the school level. So that's starting up. We just had our inaugural meeting last week, and we have more this week. So I'm pretty excited about it. What's going on
Well,
with you?
I can't think of a better person to be leading that work. And I was going to say this later, but I can't tell you how many times in the past 6 months something has happened, whether it's been something dealing with race relations in the U.S. or even just other inequitable systems that we have, that I've thought to myself, people need to be reading Josh's chapter like right now, right? Like, because it just speaks to so many systems of inequity that we have in the country. But yeah, I mean, I've been
I
doing
greatly
well.
appreciate that, Mike. Thank you. And I have a great team, but I definitely have and feel personally connected to what's going on, and my chapter does speak to that. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's good to be back in the classroom. I'm thrilled to be back with my students. I didn't realize how much I missed that until I stepped into like the first day of school and I was back with my fourth graders. I was like, oh, 14 months is a long time, right? When that's the work that you love doing. But it's just it's a different challenge than anything I've ever experienced, and that's exciting. It's intellectually stimulating to try and constantly troubleshoot, but it's exhausting.
Wow. Take me into your preparation now versus when you used to be in the classroom pre-COVID.
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge has been that teaching concurrently. So I have students that are at home at the same time that I have students in with me. And as a science teacher, everything I did before was hands-on, right? We were doing experiments in the classroom. We were, out on the garden, in the garden. We were out in the nature trail. Everything was hands-on. And now trying to run, and I hate using this term because it gets confused with the book and it's not talking about the same thing, but almost going to a flipped classroom model, where I'm recording more ahead of time because we can't do those scientific experiments in person. But then dealing with the technology issues that we have being in a rural area, with the internet going down, and so it's just a whole new pedagogical model, which I feel like at least I'm understanding enough to try and make those changes. But I know that there's a lot of people struggling right now.
Got it. Yeah, I understand that. Well, I appreciate it, and it's good to see you, and happy to talk about this work, which is only a month and a couple days away.
I know, yeah. Actually, that the book will be in people's hands on October 29th, so a month from tomorrow, which is phenomenal. And not just your chapter, but like there's so much in the book that speaks to what we need right now. And you've been there with me from the beginning. We had conversations probably 9-10 months before I even started putting an outline together of what this book was going to look like and some of the things that needed to be in there. So you know this work as well as anyone. And from the beginning, I knew that your chapter was going to be one of the linchpins in there, because because if we can't fix inequitable systems, we can't have a functioning democracy. And you make that point really well in your chapter. So why don't you start by speaking to that a little bit?
Yeah, this concept that education, if we look at some of the history of education, in the beginning, there was sort of this idea of a two-track system, sort of introduced by Jefferson. But there was always, when we got to the Common Schools movement, especially with Horace Mann and other pieces there in the Freedmen Bureau schools after Reconstruction, there's this idea that education isn't just a two-tiered system for the learned and unlearned, and it shouldn't be that if it's just. It should prepare the entire country, all the citizenry, to be productive producers and contributors to a democratic republic, right? And so when education is functioning in that way, that's what we have. But wouldn't you know, once education begins to be inequitable, and go back to this idea of a two-tiered system, then suddenly democracy is at stake. Because when you graduate kids who have these advanced ideas and can actually contribute all of who they are, then you have a democracy that represents everybody. But if you don't graduate those kids at a proportionate rate, then you have some that cannot advocate, who do not have the language and the education and the capacity or even the opportunity to connect with those levers of power with which to make democracy work for us. And so you have a really difficult situation when you don't educate everyone to the highest level possible.
Yeah, and you make the point in the beginning of your chapter, and I think this is absolutely true, that this level of inequity that we see in our system, we can say the system has been built intentionally to create this level of inequity so that power, and these are my words and not yours, but so that power is consolidated in the hands of the few, right, rather than in a more democratic, flattened hierarchical kind of model that true democracy should be.
That's right. It almost harkens back to a monarchy, right, in practice, but a democracy in word. And so it's this idea that people who have power don't want to share power because they'll have less of it. It's that binary thinking. What people have to understand is that by sharing power, it multiplies power and opportunity for everybody, right? And so I think it's constantly a struggle for that. I was looking at a recent documentary that had a quote that said tyranny and utopia are battling right up to the last minute, right? So we have to understand that the fight for that, though, in addition to in our homes and our communities, is in our classrooms.
Yeah, so what's interesting, and as we're having this conversation, you don't directly write about this in your chapter, but I touch on it in the introduction. I think both of us would agree, flat off the bat, I need to make the statement that both of us would agree that there's never been a time in American history when education has been equitable, right? So let's throw that out to start with. Yeah. But if you look at the history of the United States, and you look at the expansion of liberty and the expansion of voting rights to different groups, that very much paralleled the expansion of free public education. That's right. To certain groups of people. And you can follow that trajectory to what we could say is America's golden age, when we exceeded expectations and put a man on the moon, when we had the most thriving economy in the world, all of those that rise to of political and economic power of the United States very much followed that trajectory of expansion of liberty and expansion of education. That's right. And what I fear, and one of the reasons for me taking this on and putting this book together, is that I fear we're starting to slip back. We're starting to see a more inequitable system. I talked with Amanda Potterton and Jameson Brewer the other day about the need to keep education as a public good, because we're starting to see the privatization of education lead us into places where we have more economic segregation, more racial segregation in our schools than we've had in decades. What are your thoughts on that? How can we start stemming that tide of inequity in our education system? And I know you have a 5-point plan at the end of your chapter, which I do.
I'll speak broadly about it, because the chapter, it has things in it, and the entire book full of contributors that I just can't wait to read everybody else's. I mean, I know everybody's saying that, but I'm honest with that. So really, let's start with what you said first. And I find it very interesting, and it's powerful that you said this, that the expansion and some of our best times happen with the opening up of opportunity for education, right? The elementary, secondary act, right? And all these different pieces. Okay, so then you start seeing after Brown versus Board and shortly thereafter, and even going into the 70s and somewhere around the early 80s, when the Supreme Court was mandating integration, you also see the closing of the racial achievement gap. Mm-hmm. So when integration was occurring, there was actually a closing of the gap. And now you see the gap beginning to widen again and be more stubbornly separated, because we have gone back and resegregated schools according to social economic lines and through this redlining legacy of forced housing. So the first thing is you got to put them back together. I mean, we can't, we have to integrate schools as best we actually can. And when I say integrate schools, I don't mean just putting the bodies in the seats. I mean integrating culture, integrating the experiences of more than just one perspective, and not having a school in a school. I participated in a school where when I came there as a department chair years ago, there was only one track of gifted and talented education. I said, well, there's more than 30 students per grade that can handle. So I had to open up that piece. And so what you find sometimes is that you'll have schools within schools where certain classes are color coded. All right, well, that can't exist if all of us have to get the education that we need to contribute to this democracy. So the first thing is integrating schools fully. And that also means, by the way, integrating funding. Right? So the funding sources have to be the same. And we can have a conversation too. I'd love to have a conversation with you about how to change the funding sources, right? If you do it by property taxes, inherently there is an unequal tax base for teacher salaries, which you know. And so that's the first thing. But secondly, we have to be able to think about what is it that we are putting in front of kids curriculum-wise. And so I've been thinking about this recently about what is true, what is accurate, and how do we determine that? Right? So what's a complete history? How do you talk about the Boston Tea Party and the American Revolution? And then how do we talk about slavery in such a way that gets through the psychology of it and how brutal it was? I think we think about the brutality of that time period and we say it was a thing, we then abolish, and there was 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, let's move forward. No, we need to talk about how it was ingrained and then it was systematized. So the type of curriculum, the type of instruction that gives an accurate view of what happened is the second piece to this type of education. And I would say the last piece is making explicit the language and rules of power so that people can advocate for themselves. What does it mean from a local level to elect someone, right? I watched this, watch a lot of TV because I've been inside all the time. But I watched this documentary with my wife the other day called Boy State. And it was interesting to me because all these boys in these towns, mostly conservative, had this entire almost structure, this farm system where boys would learn the language of parliament, of power, of government. Well, that has to happen for everybody.
Yeah.
And so I think that those are three, things. There's more, but those are things: integrate the kids, interrogate the curriculum, and provide the language of power for how our society runs.
Yeah. I want to touch on those last 2 points, and I don't want to forget either one of them. So let me just touch in on that power structure for a minute. Estella, Awima Church, who I don't know how well you know Estella, but her chapter really looks at this at the classroom level, and how part of us ensuring that public schools are teaching kids to be civically engaged is teaching them to examine power structures in the classroom, in the school, in their community, in the country, right? And looking at that very intentionally, which I love. I think that, so many times if we look at our schools, and I write about this in my chapter, they're not democratic. You can't expect kids to graduate at 18 and be good democratic citizens when they've never been a democratic participant in their own classroom, their own school, their own community, right? And so we have to be intentional about that. We have to, teach them to examine those power structures. And I don't think you can separate that from curriculum, right? And I think one of the most frightening things that I've seen when you look at authoritarianism across the world, right? So the book is about how do we save democracy. The antithesis of that would be authoritarianism, dictatorship. When you look at the rise of authoritarians throughout history around the world, attacking school curriculum and nationalizing it so that certain parts of history are erased, so that questioning of any power structures is erased. That's one of the first things that happens.
Sure.
And so, I hate to take this down the, purely political path right here. But, it was about 2 weeks ago. Yeah, but about 2 weeks ago, that's what we saw as a platform coming out of the current administration, was that we need a more nationalized curriculum. And it was in direct pushback to the 1619 Project, which is doing all of the things that you're talking about, examining our racial history, examining the roots of slavery in our country and the power structures that were created and codified, after slavery ended. So, do you want to comment on that intersection between examining power structures and curriculum a little bit more?
Well, it's power concedes nothing without a demand, right? And so, the best power is the power that you don't see, and therefore you never get to interrogate. So it makes sense that a government that is more authoritarian, at least from my perspective, that is currently occupying our Oval Office, would seek to hide and obscure the true history of our country and how it manifests today. But Mike, we got to ask ourselves a question, a series of questions. What type of patriotism is that? Mm-hmm. Right? If my patriotism is based upon a willful ignorance of the country, and therefore a myopic commitment to freedom for all, then that's not patriotism, right? True patriotism is understanding that we have an imperfect union. We're moving towards a more perfect union. We haven't got there. So let's make sure that all of us are free. That's what it means to be a patriot. Right? That's what it means to truly be an American. And I can say that because as an African American, I have a history and a legacy of making America do exactly what it says it should do. And so if we're trying to hide that truth, it's only because we believe that exposing truth will take away our power. But exposing truth and giving you the opportunity to use whatever privilege and platform you have to make things more available for everybody actually gives us a more perfect union.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, it's important for us to understand that if we truly value democracy, that means we're not always going to get exactly what we want. And we're going to have to sacrifice some of our power so that others can have as well, right? Like that's the very nature of democracy. And so if we're fighting for something else, if I'm fighting for me not to lose what I care about, and others are being negatively impacted, we're moving away from democratic norms, from democratic values. Yeah,
that's right.
Yes.
And Mike, too, I can't receive with a closed hand. I have to open up my hand and open up my mind to see, because history is not just about triumph; it's also about tragedy, and we don't want to repeat the same tragedies. So I have to open my hand to another person's hand, put their hand in my hand and hear from them and have them feel me as I feel them, so that their history, whether it be indigenous folk, whether it be Black people, whether it be LGBTQ community, we have to understand the ways in which we have brutalized each other so that we don't do it again.
Yeah, it's an important point. All right, so before we run out of time, I really want to get to, I want to get to two things. You really, so the middle part of your chapter really calls out the inequities in our school system right now, and then talks about how we can fix them. And then you get into those 5 points, which I really want to make sure that we get to by the end of our conversation here. But when you're talking about inequitable school systems, you really point out 3 things that are going on right now that need to get turned around. The first is that our systems right now tend to focus on fixing people rather than fixing injustice. The second is that we have socio-political blindness in our systems. And then the third is that we've separated influence from policies, practices, and procedures in the system. So maybe just talk for a couple minutes about those 3 things, what you're trying to explain there about the system, so that we can expose what's wrong, and then I want to get into how we can fix it.
That's right. So I'm gonna start with the first piece, right? So Dr. Ibram Kendi, and also I'm forgetting his name right now. Oh yes, Paul Gorski. They both talk about this idea that people who are anti-racist and those who seek to bring freedom to don't try to fix people. They try to fix the conditions people have to contend with. I've heard it said in this Undoing Racism workshop, I'll never forget this quote. He said that people tend to critique choices, but not options. People tend to critique choices, but not options. So you critique what a person is choosing to do, but you're not critiquing the greater environment of choices they have to make. So what do we have to do? We have to fix the environment so that the choices and the options are better. Better options, better choices. So that's number one. Number two, this idea of separating influence from the policies, and I'll get to sociopolitical bias in a second, but separating influence, it's almost like there are policies that oppress, but no one who is implementing them. Somebody created them. Systems don't run themselves. Right. Somebody had to create the policy and someone is enforcing the policy, right? And so we have to connect the people to the policies, practices, and processes that they have contributed to. And here's the thing. This doesn't have to be McCarthyism. This doesn't have to be Salem witch trial. Listen, when you know and you've been revealed to have contributed something, apologize and change it. That's the essence of a democracy. It continues to correct itself upon really great foundational principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, so then the last piece of sociopolitical blindness is we don't interrogate how we got where we are and why we continue to be where we are, right? We don't consider issues of power. We don't talk about power and race and oppression and liberation. And so I think those are the three things that keep that system going. And I'm really glad to talk about it in my chapter.
Yeah, so I really, when I went through your chapter again, and as we're talking right now, and on that first point, fixing people over fixing injustice, and how the system does that rather than the inverse, I can't help but think of the Breonna Taylor situation, right? Sure. Because you put yourself in the space of those police officers, right? And I'm not trying to justify their actions at all, sure. Sure. But I think about, them following the rules of the system and breaking into a house where they then get shot at, right? Yeah. And then they return fire and we end up in this terrible, tragic situation here. And taking their actions aside, I don't even want to get into that, right? Yeah. But just looking at the choices that were the options that they had in that situation were terrible. Were terrible. The system created an environment where nothing good could happen.
That's the point.
Right. And
literally the point. Yes.
And I think that's just such a great microcosm of what you were trying to talk about in that part right there.
I'll say this real quick because we're running out of time. I do want to get to the other section that you want to talk about. Yeah. That is such a powerful point you made, though, Mike. Once they're at the door, then a set of things and actions can happen that can go wildly wrong. Mm-hmm. And we know they did. Rest in peace, Breonna Taylor. But the issue happened before they got to the door, right? It's the cop, one of the shooting cops that they allegedly fired had this long discipline file, mm-hmm. right? That with all these different charges. Why is he still there? That's a policy. Right. Someone is upholding it, right? Yeah. Why are they sweeping the different parts of the city where they were, right, to begin to replace them with possibly better, quote unquote, housing? That brings them to the system created the options, and then the choices were not great.
Right, and so if you throw those police officers in jail and you don't fix the system, you end up with the same outcome again and again and again, right? Again and again.
Outcome. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. That's right. Okay, so you give these 5 really optimistic points at the end, and for the sake of time, I'm gonna give you all 5, and then let you comment on whatever you want. Right. So so number 1, you said we have to acknowledge that an inequitable education system leads to societal inequity, right?
That's right.
Number 2, that agency and autonomy need to be handed over to the people who are impacted by the policies and procedures that are being created, right? Which we talked about a little bit.
Yeah.
That those who are leading the system need to be accountable to the communities that are impacted by that system.
Yeah.
That we need to look at both long and short-term sustainability of the changes that we're making in, and that it has to be our highest priority. We need to have urgency in making these changes. So go ahead. We have about 5 minutes left. I'll turn it over and let you kind of dive into whatever you want there.
So let me talk. All of those I think are important to talk about. I want to talk about accountability, and I want to give just a small little preview of the chapter. The chapter starts out with numbers, and starts out with a particularly interesting vignette of a documentary. I'm not going to give it away. I just think it sets it up really well for those that are going to read it and buy it, which you should buy now, pre-order. But it shrouds and it covers the context of why these systems need to change. Because as you said, Mike, and I'm so glad we mentioned the whole Breonna Taylor killing and that whole idea, because it is the system that not only creates these bad options and even worse choices, but the system also can contribute to murder. It can contribute to the death of citizens. If not physical death, it's that soul, that mental death of, and someone said that violence is a child going to school for 12 years, but only receiving 6 years of education. So there's other forms of violence that a system can create, which is why the system has to be accountable to the people it says it's supposed to support. And so if I am an administrator, or if I am a principal of a school, for example, and I say that I'm going to lead a school, I'm going to start a school, or I'm going to go to school, get these administrative credentials, I'm going to make a 6-figure salary, which most principals do, then I have to be accountable to what type of environment I've created for learning for all the kids that are under my employ. And I have to be accountable to the people, right? Evaluations of principals typically happen from the central office. Well, they should happen in tandem with the community, right? And that's not parent complaint. That's being very clear about, here are the type of kids we want to graduate from our school. Here's what I want. Here are the metrics by which I want you to hold me accountable for. Let's work together to achieve it. And if we don't, then I am not competent for the job. That is accountability. Right. That is what it looks like. That is what it feels like when I am valuing so much of my impact on the community that I say my job is worth putting up as ransom for doing a good job. And I think that's an important piece.
Yeah, that's powerful. And I think about for the NN Story keynote that I gave on the book, I created that the new graphic, right? So the original Flip the System graphic is in the book, where we have the flip triangle talking about flattened hierarchies. And I made sure to include in that new graphic that when we flatten these hierarchies, of course, we want, the collective expertise of teachers driving education decisions, because teachers serve that intersection of policy and practice. They can speak not just for one kid, but for a wide variety of students with different needs, right? But that it falls on the teachers and the administrators, as you just said, to reach out to not just students, to make sure that they are interacting with students and making sure that they are meeting student needs and building those relationships, but also to the community. Because if our public schools are not serving our communities, then we've missed the boat on the whole purpose for public education and why we collectively use tax dollars to pay for our public education system. There has to be some accountability to communities. And the other thing that strikes me about when you're having this accountability conversation is that we're talking education, but this same principle applies to our political systems, to our economic systems, to our law enforcement systems, right? If we could create this democratic value, this democratic norm, where those who are impacted are holding those who make the choices accountable, we truly have a democracy. That's the way that our elected officials are supposed to work, right? That's what democracy is supposed to look like.
That's the way. And I'm gonna tell you, Mike, just to close up, and we're running out of time, having community hold its leaders accountable is the second best type of accountability. The best is self-accountability. I should be able to, as a leader, and from the White House to the schoolhouse, I should be able to say, I have not done the job. So I abdicate this power so that someone else can come in and do the job that needs to be done so that everyone can be served. In absence of that, which is as you and I both know, is really nowhere, right? We have community accountability, which is what is a democratic principle.
Yeah. And I think in order to have that self-accountability, it gets us into self-reflection, right? We have to be self-aware. And I think Ginny Forcucci's chapter speaks to this so well. Understanding our privileges, understanding our biases, right? Because if we can't do that, then we can't truly hold ourselves accountable.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely right, Mike.
Well, Josh, this was a brilliant conversation. I can't wait for people to read your chapter. I can't wait for you to read other people's chapters.
I can't wait.
We're a month away. We're almost there.
A month away. Well, I just want to thank you for the opportunity for this time, and thank you for the opportunity to just put my thoughts in a chapter. And let's do one of these again.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah. After the book comes out. So we'll schedule one again after the book comes out. We'll talk about the other chapters and how they intersect. I would love it.
Let's do it.
All right. Sounds good, Josh.
Have a good one.
You too.